Chapter 9. The Sticky Mess. Maddie looked out the living room window and watched a strange buggy driving in the lane. "Who's coming?" Mary asked. "I don't know," Maddie replied. Then suddenly she recognized the driver to be Jonas Yoder. His wife, who was expecting a baby, probably needed a maid to help with the housework. Sarah was helping another new mother and wouldn't come home until Friday. A feeling of dread stole over Maudie. "Mother, Jonas is here," Mary shouted. "Be quiet, Mary," Maddie whispered loudly to her sister. "He's going to hear you yet." Mother bustled into the living room, wiping her hands on her apron. "He wants a maid, I'm sure," Mother said, "and Sarah's over at Levi's. Well, well, well." Jonas opened the gate and walked to the house and up the steps to the front door. Mother opened it before he had time to knock. "Come in, Jonas," she invited him. "No, that's okay, Mary. Edna had the baby last night, and we need a maid to come help. We thought of your Sarah and would really like to have her if we can." "Well, Sarah is helping Levi's right now, so she can't come." Mother looked thoughtful. "But Maddie is here, and I think she could handle it." Maddie had helped neighbors before, but never more than a day at a time. More than likely this would be for a week, or maybe 2. But there was no point in arguing. If Mother knew of someone who needed help, she would not turn them away, even if it meant going herself. Mother and Jonas were looking expectantly at her, so Maddie carefully hid her feelings. "Go get your things together, Maddie," Mother instructed her. There was nothing she could do but go to her bedroom, gather her clothes, and go along. The Jonas Yoder home was neat and orderly. Their 2 older children looked as though they were freshly bathed. Maddie was shown the room she would share with the 2 girls, Lena and Beth, and numbly hung her dresses in the small closet. Then she went to the kitchen, unsure of what to do. Jonas came out of the bedroom and told her that Edna said she could begin preparing their supper. "What shall I make?" she asked in a thin voice. "Oh, I don't know. Let me ask Edna." He disappeared into their bedroom again and seemed to be gone for a long time. When he returned, he told Maddie to make hamburger gravy and rice. Hamburger gravy and rice, Maddie thought in astonishment. Both dishes were something the Borntraggers seldom had. The gravy, no doubt, would not be as hard, but the rice? She had no idea how to make rice. She walked to the cupboard, lifted 2 kettles down, and set them on the cabinet beside the stove. Turning to the 2 little girls who were standing stiffly beside the table, she asked where to find the hamburger. "Out there in the cellar," Lena pointed to the backyard. Maddie walked outside and looked around for the cellar door. A small rooftop could be seen in the yard. She lifted the door on the end and descended into its dark, damp interior. When her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she saw row upon row of canned goods neatly arranged in groups according to the variety of fruits, meats, or vegetables. Edna was particular, Maddie soon realized, and it did nothing for her self-confidence. She soon found the meats, took a jar of hamburger from the shelf, and turned to go back to the house. Suddenly she noticed that all the jars were sitting on the edges of the shelves. None were partway back, as though a jar had been taken from the front. So Maddie went back and pulled the next jar forward until it too stood at the edge of the shelf. Deep within, a growing feeling of despair threatened to choke her. With great apprehension, she walked back to the house where she knew the little girls would be watching every move she made, and probably Edna would be listening to make sure she was doing things properly. She opened the jar of hamburger and scraped it into the frying pan. Then, with a large wooden spoon, she broke the meat apart, poured milk over it, and put a lid on top. Taking the rice from a shelf, she poured some into a kettle and covered it with water. She asked the girls if they knew how to set the table. They silently nodded their heads and began taking dishes from the cupboard. At least they had been taught how to work, Maddie thought. She wondered if she should prepare something else to go with the rice. Just hamburger didn't seem like enough. Jonas was a big man and he would be hungry. She remembered seeing green beans in the cellar, so she hurried back outside and descended the cellar steps. This time she knew where to look and soon had the jar of beans in her hand. She remembered to pull the next jar forward to sit on the edge of the shelf. When she returned to the kitchen, a strange odor greeted her. In horror, she lifted the lid on the hamburger, but to her relief discovered it just beginning to boil. Then she lifted the lid on the rice. She wondered if she had done something wrong. It looked all right, but the smell made her wonder. She took a spoon from a drawer and tried to stir it, but encountered a hard, sticky mess. It must need water, she decided. Feverishly, she grabbed the pitcher of water and poured some into the kettle. Stirring it brought little improvement. She poured in more water and stirred. This time the grains of rice began to separate and stir easier. Maddie covered the kettle of rice and returned to the hamburger. It looked like it was time to add the thickening. She tried hard to remember how Mother made thickenings for gravy and recalled seeing her shake flour and milk together in a little jar. There was no empty jar in the kitchen, so she ran to the cellar again, knowing there were some there. She grabbed one off a shelf and looked helplessly about for lids. Not finding them, she decided to send one of the little girls out to get one. This time when she returned to the kitchen, the smell of burning rice sent sharp stabs of fear into her heart. When she lifted the lid off the kettle, a great cloud of white smoke billowed to the ceiling. She snatched a hot pad, pulled the kettle off the stove, and rushed to the dry sink. Then she grabbed another kettle from the cupboard and quickly dumped the rice into it, being careful not to transfer the burned rice from the bottom of the hot kettle. Her hands were shaking and her cheeks burned. Suddenly she remembered the hamburger. It had been boiling when she went outside. Soon it would be burning too. Leaving the kettle of rice in the dry sink, she hurried to the stove and lifted the lid on the hamburger. It had nearly boiled dry, so Maddie quickly added more milk. Now she would have a little more time to take care of the rice until the fresh milk began to boil. She poured more water from the pitcher into the rice and set it back on the stove. Then she remembered to send one of the girls to the cellar to get a lid for the jar. "There are lids right here," Lena said as she pulled a drawer out beside the stove. There, in a neat row, were several pint jars with lids lying loosely on top. "Oh, okay, I wouldn't have needed to go to the cellar after this other one then," Maddie remarked, feeling a little foolish. Lena only stared at her. Maddie knew that she must be wondering why she was doing things the way she was. She poured some milk into the jar and added flour to it. Mother had often done it like that. She screwed the lid down tight and shook it vigorously. Soon she began to smell the rice again. She set the jar of thickening on the back of the stove and lifted the lid over the rice once more. To her surprise, all the water had dried up and it needed more. The kettle was nearly full of rice, and Maddie wondered if she would need to put it into a bigger kettle. She poured all the water from the pitcher into the kettle and hoped she would not need any more. If she did, she'd have to go out to the pump after it. Now she turned to the gravy, lifted the lid, and with a wooden spoon began to stir the thickening into it. At least she felt she was doing this right. The milk stopped bubbling as she stirred and soon began getting thick and lumpy. Gradually it began to boil again, and the longer it boiled, the thicker it became. Maddie added more milk and continued to stir, but the lumps would not go away, and as it returned to the boiling point again, it grew thick and pasty. Maddie stirred in more milk. Then she checked the rice. It had risen to the very top of the kettle, and Maddie thought it was probably ready. Taking a fork, she stirred a few grains at the top and thought they looked dry and fluffy, like they were supposed to. With a great sigh of relief, she lifted the kettle from the stove and set it in the dry sink. When she returned back to the gravy, she saw she would again need to stir in more milk. Just then the back door opened and Jonas appeared. "Supper time?" he asked good-naturedly. Maddie wiped the sweat from her forehead and nodded. Suddenly she remembered the beans she had planned to heat. Hurriedly she dumped them into the last kettle in the cupboard and placed them on the stove. Then she poured the last of the milk into the gravy and stirred briskly, hoping the lumps would disappear. But instead they only seemed thicker and more pasty than before. "Lena and Beth, you can pour the water for Maddie," Jonas prompted the confused little girls, "and put the bread and butter on too." Maddie had forgotten about the bread and butter and was glad he remembered them. She opened the cupboard doors in search of serving bowls. Taking 2 of the largest, she set them on the cabinet and poured gravy into one and rice into the other. Even after filling them to the top, she only half emptied the kettles. "What will I do with all the leftovers?" she wondered. She carried the bowls to the table and returned for the beans. At least she didn't make twice too many of them. She emptied them into a serving bowl and in a shy and embarrassed tone of voice told Jonas that supper was ready. Her knees were shaking as she sat down to the table, and while she waited for Jonas and the girls to sit down, her eyes swept over the kitchen in dismay. What a mess! She hoped they wouldn't notice. After bowing their heads in silent prayer, Maddie began spooning out food for the girls. Jonas prepared a plate for Edna and took it to her. Maddie hoped the rice would not taste burnt. No one mentioned it, but she felt sure they thought about it. The gravy didn't taste too bad, although it certainly was not like Mother's. She ate in silence, too embarrassed to speak. One thing was certain. She knew they would never ask her to make rice and gravy again, and maybe, just maybe, she would make it through the week. By Friday, Maddie was nearly bursting to go home. How she longed for the carefree days when she and Gidley raced Daisy and Dandy beside the road, and she hoped Sarah would be at home for the weekend. Now that they had something in common, and she couldn't wait to talk with her about it. When Jonas took her home, he handed her $2 for the week's pay. Never before had Maddie been paid for something, and it made her feel important. Sarah did indeed come home, and a restful weekend it was. Tobe was dating Nettie Nepp, and the children teased him unmercifully. Maddie believed Sarah had her eye on someone too, but Sarah denied it. Gidley especially loved to tease. He would never in his whole life get married to a silly old girl, he claimed. And to see Tobe fall so hard for Nettie was a big joke to him. Daisy was his girlfriend, and he would never need another one. But one day, when Maddie and Gidley were racing Daisy and Dandy full speed through the pasture, Daisy suddenly took a stubborn notion and stopped unexpectedly. Gidley flew fast and hard over Daisy's head and landed in a heap in front of her. He lay so still that Maddie began wondering if he had been knocked unconscious. But he slowly got to his feet, brushed the dust from his pants, and rubbed the bruised spots on his back and neck. Never again did he race with Maddie. Soon Maddie was working for other people more than at home. She worked hard and tried her best to please her employers, but always there was a deep longing in her heart to stay at home with Mother, Mary, and Lydia. She wished Sarah would not have to work away as often either. It seemed as though her family was gradually growing apart as they saw less and less of each other. She supposed Tobe was thinking of getting married before too long. Then their family would forever be different. Maddie felt sad at the changes. Is this how it felt to grow up? Was the world of grown-ups not as pleasant as she had always supposed? Sometimes Maddie just wanted to stay small, like right now. End of chapter 9.